Welcome back. So, for this lecture, this is our final unit of the semester. We're going to be talking about language acquisition with a focus on first language acquisition. This is one unit that your book will be extremely helpful for, so even if you don't check the book as often as maybe you should, Chapter 14 will be very helpful with additional details besides the lecture, so I highly encourage you to check out those details in addition to the things that we'll be talking about in these lectures for Unit 8. So when we're talking about language acquisition, this is referring to the process that we're using to either acquire or gain mastery of a first or a second, or sometimes maybe a third or fourth or fifth language. So in linguistics, we refer to these as either L1 or L2. So a person's native language or their mother tongue would be known as their L1, so L1 meaning language one or first language. And then the L1 is any language that's acquired typically before around the age 3 to 5. So if you start learning it from birth or at a very, very young age, you can gain native capacity. And native bilingual speakers or trilingual speakers will have multiple L1s. So there's only a two-way distinction. It's either a native language or an L1, or it's not a native language and it would be called an L2. So those other languages that we gain in later childhood, or if you learn a language in adulthood, would be considered a speaker's L2 for second language. And you can have multiple L1s or multiple L2s. So if someone has several languages that they speak, any of them that they started speaking from a very young age or from birth would be their L1s. And then any language or languages that you pick up later in life would be considered your L2s. And the reason we make this two-way distinction is primarily because there's a distinction in how we actually either acquire or learn those languages. So there's a difference between acquisition and learning, where an L1 is something that's acquired. You don't really have any conscious effort on the part of the speaker in doing this. So when we've gone through some examples from English and talked about the different past tense endings, for instance, no one really taught you that there were 3 different pronunciations for that. You just sort of acquired that and know the rules because you've been surrounded by the language as a native speaker. And so in most cases, a normally developing infant will become fluent in their L1 by around the age of 5. So when you are talking about gaining a language and they say that you should be about as fluent as someone who's 5, this is usually why they use that as a sort of development level, because we've gained pretty much the basics of all of the different rules that we need. You have enough vocabulary to hold a decent conversation. You've sort of mastered all of those different aspects of the sound system, of the grammar system, of enough vocabulary, etc. An L2, however, is learned. This is something that takes practice, it takes effort. You have to actually learn what those rules of phonology are, what the rules of grammar are, what those different conjugations are, what kind of lexicon there is. Those kinds of things that you don't just natively gain, but that you have to actively study and actively practice in order to gain mastery of those. So for most cases, L2 learners really won't reach full native-like ability. If you start learning a language younger, you have a better chance of sounding more native, but sometimes even things like idioms or just certain pronunciations, certain words, will still be sort of lost that if you don't have that truly native capacity. And when we're thinking about how we acquire languages, there's 2 main schools of thought into what is playing the biggest role. And so this is sort of that nature-nurture debate that we see in biology, that we see in many other areas of science, where there's debate as to how much of this human linguistic ability is innate or nature, and how much of it is learned or based on things like nurture. And no one really believes that it's 100% one or the other, but at the very beginning of the semester when we talked about the difference between formal and functional approaches to linguistics, this is where that divide is often very, very visible. So formalists will believe that it's more innate, functionalists will believe that it's more learned. And so as we've mentioned throughout the semester, your book, this class, takes a predominantly functional view of language and linguistics, but I do still want to cover what these different theories actually are so that you're familiar with some of the different schools of thought regarding this. So when we think about these different theories of acquisition, formalists believe that languages are underlyingly mostly the same. They can be described with what's known as universal grammar. So we are aided by this innate language acquisition device. We're born with this. It's something that's in our genes, that we have this sort of language acquisition piece in our minds that help us to gain language in a different way than if we were only learning it. Functionalists, however, believe that languages are too diverse to be described by one single grammar, and they follow what's known as a discourse-based theory. So infants are aided largely by things like nurture, the surroundings that they're in, including things like child-directed speech and other cognitive resources that we would call domain general, meaning they're not specific to just one area of development, one area of your brain, but are things that we can apply more broadly to many different areas of how human function works. So things like pattern finding, memory limitations, those kinds of things that we are using in our everyday life for things that aren't language specific can also be applied to how we are acquiring language. So if we compare some of these major things, if we look first at universal grammar was proposed by Noam Chomsky. He's probably one of the most famous linguists still. So this started in the 1960s, and Noam Chomsky changed the face of linguistics very heavily through a lot of these ideas of universal grammar, saying that innate linguistic knowledge is what's primarily responsible for a child's ability to acquire language. And he says that individuals' grammars are formed through what are known as principles and parameters, where principles are these sort of broad, abstract rules that would be seen as universal across all languages. So, for example, all phrases have a head. All languages have some sort of ordering of verb, object, and subject. So in English, for instance, in modern day English, we have subject and then verb and then object. In other languages, that order might be different, but all languages will have some ordering of it. So these principles are very broad, very abstract rules, whereas parameters would be the individual switches, so to speak. So you turn on or off a particular switch for a language based on what kind of feature those principles have. So for instance, English is a head initial language. Japanese would be a head final language. So an English speaker would turn on the head initial switch. A Japanese speaker would turn that one off. English is subject, verb, and object. Japanese is subject, object, verb. So they would have different switches that are being sort of turned on and off. This is the sort of metaphor that's used to convey what parameters someone is learning within this broader concept of universal grammar. However, discourse-based acquisition, which is functional as an approach, is viewed differently as a system of communication. So grammar is not seen as something that is sort of innate or embedded into our minds when we're born, but rather something that's seen as sort of a frozen discourse coming from these common patterns of talk over time. As speakers, we agree upon what's acceptable and say that this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, and that's something that's going to change over time. So these things will evolve with culture, these things will evolve as different groups of speakers agree on different parameters, different rules for what's happening. And so it views human cognition just broadly as this innate base for language. So as things evolve with culture, with different interaction, with different kinds of communication, the discourse that we use, the grammar that we use, the way that we acquire language will change along with that. And so this uses just any cognitive memory or mechanism that's necessary for learning or using language that isn't necessarily just this sort of language piece in our brain, but can apply to anything that we're doing with language or also beyond language. Whereas, so in this view, a child's environment is playing the largest role in acquisition. What they're hearing, who they're around, the way that people are speaking to them when they're around is going to have the largest influence in how acquisition happens. And there are types of evidence for either of these different major theories. So some of the evidence that's often posited for nature arguments is that there's something called the poverty of the stimulus, whereas children are hearing very little speech compared to what the possibilities are for the full language. And sometimes they're hearing things that are ungrammatical. And yet, despite this impoverished or limited or ungrammatical data, they're still able to acquire all the grammatical rules they need for their language in about 5 years or less. And the argument here is that learning something this complex, this quickly, would be seen as impossible without some sort of aid, some sort of innate universal grammar, innate linguistic function that we're born with genetically that would help us in order to make this happen. So this is used as this evidence because they argue that all children, regardless of language, regardless of where they're from, are acquiring language at roughly the same pace. So their argument is that language is sort of maturing just as the body matures. Things like growth and puberty are things that happen to us the same way that language just kind of happens to us. And there's a quote that Noam Chomsky is known for, that there are properties of our language which are just as much a part of our nature as the fact that we have arms and not wings. So it's a very biological, a very evolutionary argument that says that we're sort of embedded with this linguistic capacity as humans in a way that other animals do not have. On the other hand, nurture-based evidence comes from things like child-directed speech. And the argument here is that child-directed speech is not ungrammatical. It's slower, it's more repetitive. We use a lot of statistical regularities when we're speaking in child-directed speech. And this changes from culture to culture based on what's most important to those cultures. And young children tend to use the words and the constructions of their caregivers at about the same rate. So their caregivers are sort of giving them input, they're taking that input and they're applying it, and they're able to sort of flesh out the rest of the language based on this kind of input. There's also a very big argument in the nurture evidence that we don't just kind of learn a language and then stop once we're 5. Our idiolects and our dialects are things that are changing over time. We never stop acquiring language. So it's not that we just acquire the rules of language and then have this sort of fixed use forever. We're constantly evolving as the language is changing. So we're constantly changing the rules that we have for language. We're constantly evolving with new vocabulary, with new words that are brought in, with new changes that might be happening within the language. So we're constantly acquiring language throughout our lives. It's not just something that happens as we're young. Also, a big part of this is that there's a lot of domain general areas of our cognitive process, things like analogy, memory limitations, pattern finding, that aren't specific to language but can also be applied to language. So even if we don't hear every single piece of grammar, we can take analogies and we can take sort of pattern finding and say, well, if it's like this in this case and it's like this in this case, then these other areas are things that we can sort of extrapolate out from and come to a pattern based on that. So we don't need a separate innate linguistic function, a separate innate acquisition device, because we already have the capability with how human brains function to apply those kinds of processes to language as well. And finally, languages are just so diverse that the nurture argument says that we can't just say that there's one single universal grammar to account for all of them. Most of the research that's done with formal arguments are done with Indo-European languages and some other highly spoken languages. There's not as widespread of an understanding of how languages that are very diverse work in the same way that nurture arguments would argue for. And in either form, but especially with nurture arguments, child-directed speech plays a huge role in this. So child-directed speech would be a special register of talk that adults and older children are using when they're speaking to younger children. We sometimes use this to talk to pets or significant others, but it's usually in those very specific moments. And in Western cultures, child-directed speech is typically characterized by raising our pitch to a higher pitch. We use a slower pace. We tend to lengthen our pauses between words. We use shorter clauses, shorter sentences. We tend to use a lot of reduplication and repetition in the things that we're saying that can help solidify the pieces of language that a child needs to acquire and that a child needs to pay attention to. This is something that changes from culture to culture. So different cultures have different features of child-directed speech. In some cultures, toddlers aren't considered to be legitimate conversational partners at all, and they don't engage in conversations with them until they're able to speak themselves. But this doesn't mean that they can't acquire language. It doesn't mean that they're not acquiring language. They're still exposed to language. They're still hearing it. They're just not talked to directly in the same way that we would expect in Western cultures. So there's lots of cultures that don't ask toddlers questions, that don't engage in these conversations with children the same way that we would expect people to. So most of our child-directed speech are things that are aimed at upper and middle-class Westerners that tend to do this to prepare children for school. We have an expectation when you're in the school system that you're going to ask questions, that you're going to engage in that back and forth. Not all cultures have that same expectation, so the way that child-directed speech is organized would look different based on the kinds of things you're expected to value as a speaker of that language and as a member of that community. So when we're thinking about these studies and the way that we've come up with the patterns that we'll see in these other lectures that are to come, there's different ways that these studies tend to occur. So there's typically a combination of either an observational or an experimental study and either a longitudinal or a cross-sectional study. So if you remember back when we were looking at the WUG test, the WUG test is an example of an experimental and cross-sectional study where you have an experiment design in a closed environment and you're studying many people at the same time. And there's pros and cons to each of these. So we'll look briefly at what all of these options are. So observational studies look at things like audio and video recordings of language in use in the moment that it's being used. So you're not controlling the data. So it gives you an advantage of having a natural language use, what people are actually just doing in their everyday lives. But There's no control variables in a situation like this. So the recordings might not capture all of the features of language that you want to study. It can give you some really good information about what's happening in an everyday situation. But if you're trying to understand how people are acquiring the past tense pronunciations, for instance, you might not actually find any examples of those if they're not used in the data that you have naturally. So it might not capture everything that you're really looking to discuss, which is where experimental studies come in, because these are designed to look for specific questions about specific aspects of language usage. So you can control variables, you can force subjects to use certain words or certain constructions. You can sort of prime them for thinking about things. So I have one wug, now I have two wugs. You can create a test to get particular aspects of language usage. But these aren't always natural. There's a lot of lab artifacts. It's not the most comfortable setting a lot of times to be sitting in a lab and talking about those things, answering these very specific questions. So it doesn't always give you the most natural results when you're using these kinds of studies. The other sort of axis of these studies is whether or not they're longitudinal or cross-sectional. Longitudinal studies tend to look at just a few subjects over a very long period of time. It can be really expensive to do these kinds of studies. These are more like case studies because you're looking at people over a very long period of time, sometimes a few years, sometimes up to 20 years. You may be following someone from birth into adulthood. There have been studies like this. And this gives a really good detailed examination about how languages are acquired over time with these particular subjects. But it's very hard to generalize these with such a small sample size. Many of these studies only have 3 to 5 participants. So you can say, well, we're noticing these things happening amongst the people that we're studying, but it's hard to really broaden and generalize those results to an entire population because you have such a small sample size. So cross-sectional studies are used instead, where you can look at many subjects at one point in time, and you can get a very large sample size. You can look at 100 3-year-olds, 100 4-year-olds, 100 5-year-olds, more than that even. And you get a very large sample size. But because you're looking at several different groups of people in one point in time, it doesn't necessarily show exactly how language develops over time. So it's really a combination of all of these different types of studies that becomes useful when we're thinking about the patterns we've noticed, the sort of time frame we see for how language acquisition takes place, especially among children. So in the next lectures, we'll actually look into that time frame and look at what sort of features tend to occur at which ages. But for now, if you have any questions, shoot an email, schedule office hours, bring questions to class, and we'll be able to talk about them then.